You'll get nothing. That was the phrase they settled on in the end, not whispered, not softened, spoken plainly as if it were a fact already agreed upon, like the weather or the time of day. We were standing in the marble foyer of the house that had never truly been mine, though I had lived there for nearly 20 years. The floors were polished to a dull shine, reflecting the chandelier above us, a chandelier I had never chosen but had dusted myself when the staff went home. His sister stood closest to me, arms crossed, her mouth drawn into a thin, satisfied line. Two of his cousins hovered behind her, quiet but attentive, the way people are when they believe they are about to witness something final. "You should prepare yourself," his sister said. "These things are decided long before anyone gets sick." No one contradicted her. No one looked uncomfortable. They spoke as if I were already gone, as if my presence was temporary, an inconvenience soon to be corrected. I remember nodding, not because I agreed, but because I understood what nodding did for people like them. It reassured them. It confirmed their assumptions. It made them careless. My husband was upstairs, asleep, his breathing shallow and uneven. The doctors had stopped using words like recovery and started using phrases that sounded considerate but meant the same thing. Limited time. Focus on comfort. Make arrangements. His family had already begun. They had always spoken about money as though it were a living thing that belonged to them by blood alone. Not in exact numbers, not yet. Just references, holdings, interests, foundations, properties that spanned cities I had never visited and accounts I had never been allowed to see. Even after all those years, even after marriage, even after illness reduced him to a man who needed help sitting up in bed, they spoke as though I were still a guest. "You were taken care of," one of the cousins said gently, as if offering sympathy. "No one can deny that." Taken care of, as if I had been a responsibility, not a wife. I did not remind them that I had given up my own work to manage his household when his health began to fail. I did not mention the nights I slept in a chair beside his bed or the months I learned how to read lab results because no one else bothered to explain them to him slowly. Those details did not interest them. They were already looking beyond me. His sister continued, lowering her voice, though there was no one else in the house to overhear. "You should speak to your own lawyer. There will be provisions, of course, something reasonable, but the estate itself is not something you need to concern yourself with." I remember thinking how carefully she avoided saying numbers, how careful they all were. They did not want me to understand the scale of what they believed they were protecting from me. "You'll get nothing," she repeated, this time without the pretense of kindness. "Not from the real assets." There it was. The final verdict, delivered before the man upstairs had even died. I felt something then, but it was not anger. Anger would have required me to believe that their opinion mattered. What I felt was colder, a quiet clarity, the understanding that they had already written the ending of a story they did not fully understand. They assumed my silence meant defeat, that my lack of protest meant ignorance. They mistook restraint for weakness, as they always had. I had learned early in that family that emotions were treated like admissions of guilt. If you defended yourself, you were hiding something. If you explained yourself, you were justifying something. The safest position was stillness. So I stayed still. I watched as they spoke about timelines and formalities, about how the will reading would be handled, about which firm would oversee it. They said these things in front of me, not to include me, but because they did not consider me capable of following. His sister smiled once briefly when she noticed how quiet I was. "It will be easier this way," she said, "for everyone." For everyone except me, she meant. I excused myself before they were finished. No one stopped me. I went upstairs, past the portraits of men whose names were spoken with reverence at holidays, men whose wealth had multiplied with each generation. I entered the bedroom and closed the door softly behind me. My husband was awake. His eyes moved toward me, slower than they once had, but still sharp. "They were here," he said. I nodded. He did not ask what they said. He did not need to. He had lived with them longer than he had lived with me. He knew their language. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The machines filled the silence with their steady, artificial reassurance. Finally, he said, "They think they know how this ends." I sat beside him and took his hand. It was thinner than it used to be, the veins more visible, the skin fragile. He squeezed my fingers once, not tightly, but deliberately. "They always do," I said. At the time, I did not know how literal his words would become. What I did know was this: every person downstairs believed the same thing. That when the will was read, I would be acknowledged politely and dismissed quickly. That whatever fortune remained would return to its rightful owners, redistributed among familiar names and bloodlines. They believed the story was already finished. They were wrong. I did not grow up around people like them. That is the simplest way to explain the distance they sensed in me from the beginning. It was not just my clothes or my accent or the fact that I asked questions they considered unnecessary. It was something deeper, a way of moving through the world without assuming it already belonged to me. I met my husband long before his name carried weight in my life. At the time, it carried weight in boardrooms and legal documents, but I did not know that yet. We were introduced through a professional setting, one of those carefully curated events where people pretended to talk about ideas while quietly assessing one another's usefulness. I was there because of my work. He was there because people like him were always there. He spoke less than most men in the room. When he did speak, others listened without interrupting. That was the first sign of his influence, though I did not recognize it then. What I noticed instead was that he asked questions that were not strategic. He asked about my background without trying to place it on a hierarchy. He listened without glancing over my shoulder. When he asked me to dinner weeks later, it felt personal in a way I was not accustomed to. Not indulgent, not performative, just deliberate. He did not mention money on that first dinner. He spoke about responsibility, about how early success had narrowed his life instead of expanding it, about how his family had long confused control with care. I listened, cautious but curious. Men who spoke this way often contradicted themselves later. He did not. Over time, I learned what his name meant. Doors opened when he made calls. People deferred before he asked them to. There were properties he never visited and accounts he never discussed. But none of that was how he defined himself, and none of it was how he defined me. When he proposed, it was not elaborate. No audience, no spectacle. He asked me if I understood what marrying into his family would mean, not in terms of comfort, but in terms of resistance. "They will test you," he said, quietly, constantly. I told him I was not afraid of being disliked. He smiled then, but it was not relief. It was recognition. The first time I met his family as his fiancée, I understood immediately that the warning had been insufficient. They were polite in the way people are when politeness is a performance. Questions were asked with smiles that never reached their eyes. Compliments were delivered as assessments. I was introduced repeatedly, as though repetition might turn me into something more familiar. His sister studied me openly. His cousins asked about my parents in a tone that suggested a conclusion had already been reached. No one asked what I wanted, only what I planned to do. I did not fit into their narrative. I was educated, but not in the institutions they respected. Independent, but not in ways they valued. I did not need them, and that unsettled them more than any ambition would have. After the wedding, the distance sharpened. They never accused me of anything directly. That would have required acknowledging my importance. Instead, they questioned my competence through implication. Invitations arrived late or not at all. Conversations stopped when I entered rooms. Decisions were made without my knowledge and explained to me later as formalities. I noticed early that financial discussions ended when I appeared. Not abruptly, just smoothly redirected as though my presence changed the weather. When I asked my husband about it, he did not deny it. "They believe information is power," he said, "and they don't believe you should have any." He never hid anything from me, but he also did not wage war on my behalf. That was his way. He believed in patience, in letting people reveal themselves fully before responding. At times, I wondered if that patience would cost us something. As the years passed, his health began to change. Not dramatically at first. Small adjustments, missed meetings, a growing reliance on routine. His family framed it as stress, as temporary exhaustion. They did not like weakness, even when it was unavoidable. I stepped into roles no one had formally offered me, coordinating appointments, managing household staff, making decisions when he was too tired to engage. I did these things quietly, without announcing them, because announcing them would have turned them into threats. His family noticed anyway. His sister once remarked, during a holiday dinner, that I seemed very comfortable giving instructions. She said it lightly, but the table went quiet. "Someone has to," I replied. My husband did not intervene. He let the silence sit. That was the first time I sensed a shift, subtle but permanent. They were not just wary of me anymore. They were watching me. By the time his illness could no longer be minimized, they had already formed their conclusion. I was temporary, a caretaker, a footnote, someone who would exit gracefully once her usefulness had ended. They spoke openly about legacy in front of me, about preserving the family line, about stewardship, never about partnership, never about marriage as an equal bond. I understood then that their confidence did not come from cruelty alone. It came from precedent. They had seen women like me before, wives who were absorbed and then erased, names that disappeared from records once assets were redistributed. They assumed I would be the same. What they never understood was that my husband saw the family differently than they saw themselves. He did not confuse tradition with virtue. He did not believe longevity equaled entitlement. And in the quiet moments, when it was just the two of us, when the house felt less like a monument and more like a shelter, I began to understand that he was making choices they could not see. At the time, I did not know how far those choices would reach. But I knew this much. My place in his life was not an accident, and whatever his family believed about my future, they had misjudged the man they thought they understood. The first time I realized they were doing it intentionally, it was almost disappointing. Up until then, I had allowed myself the comfort of ambiguity. I told myself they were busy, that they were set in their ways, that families like theirs moved according to customs I had not been raised to recognize. It was easier to believe misunderstanding than design. But design reveals itself in repetition. It began with meetings I was not told about, not important ones according to them, just discussions, just updates. Things my husband would summarize later in a few careful sentences, never unkind but noticeably incomplete. When I asked questions, he answered them. When I asked why I had not been included, he did not pretend not to notice. "They don't see you as necessary," he said once, evenly. "They see you as adjacent." Adjacent, not irrelevant, that distinction mattered to them. At family gatherings, the comments grew more precise. Compliments aimed just off-center. Observations framed as concern. "It must be strange for you," one cousin said, during a dinner meant to celebrate my husband's recovery from a minor procedure, "to live with this level of responsibility and not be involved in it." Another asked, with feigned curiosity, whether I ever felt overwhelmed managing a household of that size without professional training. The implication was clear. I was performing, not leading, acting a role, not earning it. I learned quickly that responding directly only sharpened their interest. Silence dulled it, so I became economical with my words, polite, observant. I watched how his sister positioned herself physically in rooms, how she took the seat closest to him, how she spoke for him when his energy waned. She never interrupted him, but she anticipated him, which was more effective. People stopped asking him questions directly and began addressing her instead. She framed this as care. "I just don't want him to be burdened," she said, resting her hand briefly on his shoulder. I noticed how rarely that hand touched him in private. The cousins followed her lead. Decisions about properties were discussed as if they were communal knowledge. Conversations ended when I entered, then resumed with artificial brightness, the tones subtly altered. I was never explicitly excluded. That would have required justification. Instead, I was bypassed. There were moments when the effort became almost meticulous. Documents left on tables, turned face down. Calls taken in other rooms. Schedules adjusted without informing me. When I mentioned something I had overheard, the room would still, and someone would change the subject with practiced ease. Once, during a charity event, a woman I barely knew congratulated my husband on his foresight. "You're very wise," she said, smiling, "to keep family matters in the family." She glanced at me when she said it, not apologetically, just long enough to register that she had made her point. My husband noticed my expression later that evening. We were in the car, the city lights sliding past the windows, and he asked if I wanted to talk about it. "There's nothing to say," I told him. "They've already decided who I am." He did not argue. He rarely did when he agreed. As his health declined, their behavior shifted again. What had once been subtle became procedural. His sister took control of his calendar. His cousins began accompanying him to appointments I had already scheduled. They justified it as support, as relief. I watched as access became currency. When I pushed back, gently, I was framed as emotional. When I stepped aside, I was framed as disengaged. There was no position that did not serve their narrative. The most effective moment came the day his sister spoke to me alone. We were in the library, a room that smelled of old paper and furniture polish. She closed the door behind her with deliberate care. "I want to be very clear with you," she said. "No one is trying to hurt you." She paused, as though giving me time to feel grateful. "But you have to understand that this family has existed long before you," she continued, "and it will exist long after." I waited. "When the time comes," she said, lowering her voice, "we will make sure you are comfortable, but you cannot expect control. That would be inappropriate." There it was again, comfort, as though my marriage had been an arrangement. "I'm not asking for control," I said. She smiled, thin and patient. "That's good, because you won't have it." After she left, I stood alone in that room for a long time. I looked at the spines of books no one read anymore, collected to signal taste rather than curiosity. I thought about how carefully they had constructed a version of me that served them. What they did not know was that their efforts had been noticed by the one person whose opinion actually mattered. My husband had grown quieter in those months, but not less observant. Illness had taken his strength, not his clarity. He watched how conversations shifted when I entered. He noticed who spoke for him and who listened. One evening, when the house was quiet and his family had gone, he asked me to sit beside him. "They think they're protecting me," he said. I did not respond. "They think they're protecting the estate," he continued, "from you." This time, I looked at him. "They don't understand," he said softly, "that I've been paying attention." At the time, I did not know what form that attention would take. I only knew that something had been decided without ceremony. And that when the moment came, it would not be loud. His decline was not sudden. That is important to say because sudden endings invite chaos, and this was not that. This was slow, measured, almost disciplined. There were days when he seemed almost himself. He would read for an hour, ask about small things, comment on the weather as if it mattered. Then there were days when lifting his head from the pillow took effort, and words came out softer, thinner, like they had to pass through something heavy before reaching the air. His family preferred the first kind of day. They visited when he looked strong enough to reassure them. On the harder days, they sent messages, thoughtful ones, carefully worded ones. I stopped expecting more. The doctors spoke to me directly. That was another shift, one that did not go unnoticed. They asked me about his pain levels, his appetite, his moods. They trusted my answers. They adjusted care based on what I said. His sister noticed this too. "You're with him all the time," she remarked once, not accusing but not approving either. "You must be exhausted." "I'm fine," I said. She studied me as if measuring something invisible. "Still," she said, "it's good he has family around as well." Family, the word landed where it always did. As his strength faded, his awareness sharpened in unexpected ways. He noticed tone, timing, who arrived early and who stayed late, who spoke to him and who spoke about him. One evening, after his cousins had left, he asked me to close the door. "They talk like I'm already gone," he said. I did not disagree. "They forget," he continued, "that I can still hear." There was no anger in his voice, just fatigue, the kind that comes from seeing something clearly for too long. It was around this time that he asked me to bring him certain documents, not all at once, slowly, a folder one week, a sealed envelope another. He did not explain himself in detail. He did not need to. "Just sit with me," he said, after we finished reviewing one of them. "That's enough." I learned not to ask questions that invited explanation. He told me what I needed to know when I needed to know it. The rest he carried alone. One night, when sleep would not come easily for him, he asked me if I regretted marrying into his life. "Not your life," I said, "just the noise around it." He smiled faintly. "They think silence means consent," he said. "They've thought that all their lives." I understood then that what was happening was not reactive. It was not emotional. It was deliberate. He was not trying to punish anyone. He was trying to correct something. In his final weeks, the visits became more formal, shorter, more focused. His sister began bringing a notebook. His cousins asked about timelines, about arrangements. I stayed nearby, but out of sight as they preferred. I heard enough. He never contradicted them directly. He let them speak, let them assume. That was his final gift to them, confidence. When the house finally grew quiet for good, it happened in the early hours of the morning. No audience. No family gathered at the bedside. Just the two of us and the sound of his breathing slowing until it stopped. I did not call anyone right away. I sat there longer than I can measure, holding his hand, letting the stillness settle into the room, into me. When the calls were made later that day, grief arrived in controlled waves. His sister cried openly. His cousins spoke in hushed voices about legacy and responsibility, about honoring his wishes. I listened. They began planning almost immediately. The will reading was scheduled with efficiency. They spoke of it as a formality, something to be endured before order was restored. No one asked me what I expected. No one asked me what I knew. They mistook my quiet for ignorance, again. What they did not see was that every step they took toward that reading had already been accounted for, every assumption carefully noted, every confidence allowed to grow unchecked. By the time the date was set, they were certain of the outcome. And I was certain of something else. That the man they believed they understood had spent his final strength making sure the truth would be heard, even if it was only once. The will reading was held in a room designed to make people feel small. High ceilings, dark wood panels, chairs placed in careful lines, all facing the long table at the front. Nothing about the space invited comfort. It was built for authority, not grief. They arrived early. His sister first, dressed in black that looked chosen for effect more than mourning. The cousins followed, quiet but alert, taking seats near the front. They greeted one another with nods and low voices, already aligned, already settled in their roles. I arrived alone. No one offered me a seat. I chose one near the middle, close enough to hear everything clearly, far enough not to intrude. A few heads turned. No one smiled. They did not look at me the way people look at someone about to lose everything. They looked at me the way people look at a closed chapter. The lawyer entered last, calm, precise. He carried a thin folder, nothing dramatic, nothing heavy. That detail struck me then. They had expected something thicker, something that looked like weight. The lawyer offered brief words about procedure, about respect, about final wishes. His voice did not change when he spoke my husband's name. That steadiness unsettled his sister. I saw it in the way she shifted in her chair. The reading began. At first, everything unfolded exactly as they expected. Specific gifts were named, charitable contributions, trusts that had existed for years. properties assigned back into family control. Each name spoken felt like a confirmation of what they already believed. I remained still. I did not look at them. I watched the lawyer's hands instead. How carefully he turned each page, how unhurried he was. Then came the pause. It was small, almost nothing. A breath held slightly longer than before. His sister leaned forward, ready. The lawyer looked up. "At this point," he said, "there is a personal directive." Personal, that word had not been discussed. He read slowly, not dramatically, just clearly. He spoke about intent, about clarity of mind, about decisions made without pressure or influence. He named me. Not as a beneficiary, not yet. As his wife. It was the first time anyone in that room had said the word with weight. The lawyer continued. He described how control of the remaining assets would transfer, not to a committee, not to family oversight. To me. The room did not react right away. Silence took a moment to land. Then it broke unevenly. His sister stood up. "That can't be correct," she said, already turning toward the lawyer. "There must be conditions." The lawyer did not argue. He simply continued reading. Full authority, immediate effect, no shared control, no delays. One cousin laughed softly, not out of humor, but disbelief. Another whispered something sharp under their breath. I felt none of what they expected me to feel. No rush, no triumph, just a steady awareness settling into place. The lawyer finished the section and closed the folder. "This concludes the reading," he said. No one moved. His sister spoke again, her voice tighter now. "This doesn't reflect what we discussed." The lawyer met her gaze. "It reflects what he decided." I stood then, not to speak, not to explain, just to leave. As I walked past them, I felt their attention shift, sharp and sudden, like a light turned too quickly. They had believed certainty was on their side. They had been wrong. They did not speak to me as I walked out of the room. Not at first. Their silence followed me down the hallway, heavy and disordered. I could feel it pressing in, the sound of plans breaking apart behind closed mouths. By the time I reached the door, his sister's voice cut through it. "This isn't over." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Threat in that family was delivered as promise. I turned to face her. For the first time in years, we stood on equal ground. No audience, no role to perform. "It is," I said. That was all. In the days that followed, they tried every path that still looked open. Lawyers called, meetings were requested, messages arrived with careful language, pretending concern. They spoke of grief, of confusion, of the need to make sure everything was done properly. I attended none of it. The will was clear. That clarity was my husband's final protection. There were no gaps to explore, no soft edges to press. Each attempt ended the same way, quietly, firmly. Their tone changed when they realized this. Concern gave way to irritation. Irritation hardened into something colder. Invitations stopped. So did condolences. People who had once greeted me warmly now avoided eye contact. It did not matter. What surprised them most was not that they had lost control. It was that I did not rush to take it. I did not sell anything. I did not restructure immediately. I did not announce decisions. I took time. I read. I reviewed. I listened to people who spoke plainly. I let the weight of responsibility settle before moving it. That patience unsettled them more than any display would have. His sister requested one final meeting, just the two of us, no lawyers. I agreed. She spoke first, as she always had, about family, about legacy, about how things were supposed to work. "You don't understand what you're holding," she said. "I do," I replied. She searched my face for something. Greed, fear, hesitation. She found none of it. "This isn't personal," she said, as if saying it often enough might make it true. "It is," I said, "just not in the way you think." She left shortly after. We never met again. The social shift was slower, but just as clear. Doors that had once opened because of proximity now opened because of authority. People who had ignored me now asked for my opinion, not because they valued it, but because they needed it. I remained measured. I did not seek approval. I did not offer explanations. Grief does not disappear just because order has been restored. I missed my husband in quiet ways, in habits, in pauses, in the empty space beside me at night. But alongside that grief was something steadier. Clarity. I understood then what he had done. He had not left me wealth as reward. He had left me responsibility as trust. He had corrected a pattern that had been allowed to repeat for generations. They had believed power belonged to blood. He had believed it belonged to judgment. Time has a way of stripping events down to what mattered. In the weeks after the will was enforced, everything felt loud. Messages, opinions, people who had never spoken to me before suddenly felt entitled to conversation. Some offered praise they clearly did not mean. Others offered advice they had not been asked to give. I let most of it pass. I stayed in the house longer than anyone expected, not because I was unsure, but because leaving too quickly would have turned it into a statement. I did not want statements. I wanted space to think. The house felt different without him, not empty, just quieter, like a place that had finished telling its story. I walked through rooms he rarely entered and rooms he loved. I found small reminders he had never pointed out. A book marked halfway through, notes in his handwriting direct and spare, lists that ended mid-thought. He had not been a sentimental man, but he had been careful. That care showed itself in what he left behind and in what he did not. His family faded from my daily life almost completely. There were no more calls framed as concern, no invitations meant to observe rather than include. They had accepted at last that access was no longer theirs by default. Occasionally, I would hear things through others, that they felt betrayed, that they believed I had influenced him, that the outcome was unfair. I did not respond. Defending myself would have meant stepping back into a story I no longer belonged to. What remained instead was responsibility and the quiet weight of carrying it alone. I made changes slowly, not because I feared reaction, but because decisions of that size deserve patience. Some structures stayed the same. Others shifted in ways that reflected how the world actually worked, not how it was supposed to look. I surrounded myself with people who spoke clearly, who disagreed without insult, who understood that authority did not need to announce itself. In private moments, I thought of my husband often, not with longing, but with recognition. I understood now how deeply he had observed the people around him, how carefully he had chosen when to speak and when to remain still. He had trusted me with what he believed they would misuse. That trust was not loud. It did not need to be. The world eventually moved on. It always does. His name still carried weight, but it no longer defined my days. I learned to exist outside the shadow of what he had built, while still honoring it. I was no longer adjacent. I was accountable. I am telling this now, from a distance, that makes honesty easier. Years have passed. Enough time for emotions to settle into memory instead of reaction. Enough time for the noise to fade, leaving only what mattered. People often assume that moments like that will reading change you all at once. That power arrives like a switch being flipped. That justice feels sharp and satisfying. It does not. What came instead was stillness. The kind that arrives after a long tension finally releases. Not relief, not victory, just the sense that something had been set right, quietly, without ceremony. I did not win anything that day. That is the truth. What I received was not a prize. It was a continuation, a responsibility my husband believed I could carry without turning it into a weapon. His family never understood that. They believed control was something to be defended. He believed it was something to be earned and then protected from the wrong hands. They had measured me by my silence, by my restraint, by my refusal to fight in ways they recognized. They assumed that meant I was unaware. They never considered that I was watching. If there is a lesson in all of this, it is not about wealth or revenge or proving people wrong. It is about dignity, about how some decisions do not need witnesses, about how quiet choices often last longer than loud ones. When I think of my husband now, I do not think of the assets or the shock or the faces in that room. I think of the calm certainty in his voice when he said they thought they knew how it would end. He was right. They never saw this ending coming. And that, I believe, was exactly the point.